It all happened in an instant. 5 minutes. That's all it took for a life built on titles, privileges, and royal identity to change forever. Imagine being Prince Harry, walking through your life with the weight of history on your shoulders, believing that some things, your title, your place in the line of succession, your connection to the monarchy, were unshakable. And then, out of nowhere, a single decision from King Charles sent a shockwave that would ripple through your family, your world, and the world at large. What would you do if the very foundation you trusted was stripped away in less time than it takes to finish a cup of tea? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just hours ago, the royal household received news that no one anticipated. The palace, usually a fortress of tradition and careful statements, was in turmoil. Whispered phone calls, frantic messages, confidential meetings behind closed doors. Every corner of Buckingham Palace was buzzing with tension. And at the center of it all, Harry sat stunned, staring at a message that would forever redefine his identity. The title that had followed him since birth, Prince, was no longer his. Not just a symbolic gesture, not just a ceremonial change. An unexpected order from the king had made it official. 5 minutes ago, everything changed. But what led to this moment, and why now? To understand the gravity of this, we need to rewind. Harry's journey has never been ordinary. From the day he was born, cameras flashed, tabloids speculated, and expectations weighed heavily. He grew up in a world where every move was scrutinized, every smile analyzed, every misstep amplified. Yet, despite the pressure, he carved a path that was uniquely his own, a path that increasingly put him at odds with the traditional royal structure. Marrying Meghan Markle, stepping back from royal duties, building a new life in America. Each decision was met with criticism, fascination, and at times, outright hostility. And yet, through it all, he retained his title, a tether to the institution that both embraced and rejected him. Now, that tether has been severed. Think about the symbolism. Titles are not just words in a royal context. They represent legacy, history, privilege, and duty. Losing a title like Prince is more than a personal blow. It's a public statement, a signal to the world that the relationship between the monarch and the individual has shifted irreparably. And in this case, it's not just any shift. It's one that will be dissected by historians, analysts, and gossip columns for decades. But Harry didn't learn this through a carefully worded press release or a prepared statement. No, this was immediate, raw, and jarring. A decision delivered in a form that left no room for preparation or response. What makes this moment even more extraordinary is the timing. In recent months, Harry had been gradually stepping back into public life, seeking to rebuild relationships and reshape his narrative. He had started philanthropic projects, engaged in interviews, and cautiously reconnected with members of his family. There was a sense, perhaps illusory, that bridges could be repaired, tensions eased, and misunderstandings clarified. And then, in one decisive stroke, the king's order obliterated all of that progress. This was not a slow, drawn-out legal process or a negotiated compromise. It was sudden. It was absolute. It was devastating. You might be wondering, why would King Charles act now? What prompted this abrupt, unprecedented move? The palace has been tight-lipped, but insiders hint at a convergence of factors. First, there's the issue of precedent. Every monarch must consider how decisions today will echo through history. A concession perceived as weakness could undermine authority. A gesture seen as leniency could create a domino effect with other members of the royal family. Second, there's personal dynamics. For decades, the relationship between Charles and Harry has been complicated, strained by expectations, misunderstandings, and deeply personal grievances. Perhaps this decision was less about protocol and more about a culmination of unresolved tensions, simmering beneath the surface for years. Third, there's timing. Events leading up to this order, public statements, media coverage, strategic appearances, may have triggered a response designed to assert control, reaffirm hierarchy, and set the record straight in the public eye. And yet, even with all this context, the human element cannot be overstated. Losing a title is not just about paperwork or protocol. It's about identity, recognition, and legacy. Imagine the personal turmoil Harry must be experiencing, the shock, the confusion, the fear of what the world will think. How does one process the realization that an institution that shaped your entire life has, in a single decision, redefined your role? What conversations happen behind closed doors when the stakes are this high? What is said, and what is left unsaid? And perhaps most importantly, how does this affect those closest to him, his wife, his children, and the family he still calls his own? From an outsider's perspective, this might seem like another headline in the ongoing saga of the British royal family, a scandalous snippet to be dissected, tweeted about, and debated endlessly. But for Harry, the implications are profoundly personal. Every public appearance, every philanthropic initiative, every interaction with the press now carries the weight of this new reality. He is navigating a world in which his very title, once a source of privilege and security, has been stripped away. How does one redefine themselves when even the simplest form of identification no longer applies? It's a question that cuts to the heart of identity, loyalty, and self-perception. And yet, amid the chaos, there is the element of uncertainty. What exactly did the king intend with this order? Was it purely symbolic? Was it a warning? Or was it the opening act of a larger plan to reshape the monarchy in ways the public has not yet imagined? Royal insiders suggest that there is more to this story than meets the eye. Documents, correspondences, and private communications hint at strategic reasoning, long-term planning, and perhaps even attempts at reconciliation that were left unspoken. Every palace official, every advisor, and every family member has a theory, but none can predict how Harry will respond or how the world will interpret the unfolding events. You might ask, how does the public fit into this story? The reaction is instantaneous. Social media explodes, news channels scramble for breaking coverage, and commentators offer their hot takes, all while Harry grapples with the reality that his life has irrevocably changed. Fans rally in support, critics voice outrage, and international media frame the story in terms of legacy, drama, and scandal. Every headline, every post, every trending topic becomes a mirror reflecting the personal crisis at the center of this storm. But no matter the commentary, one truth remains. The decision itself has shifted the balance of Harry's life, both public and private, in a way that is impossible to ignore. And yet, there's a paradox here. While this moment is devastating, it also opens a new chapter, an uncertain, precarious, but potentially transformative chapter. Titles are powerful, yes, but they are not the sole measure of worth or impact. Harry has demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and determination in the face of relentless scrutiny and expectation. How he navigates this new reality could redefine him not just as a member of the royal family, but as a figure in global consciousness. Will he retreat, retaliate, or rise? The world watches, captivated, questioning what will come next. Consider this. Every royal drama has its consequences, and few have been as immediate or as shocking as this. History will record this moment as a turning point, not only for Harry, but for the monarchy itself. Every future decision, every public appearance, every interaction with the media will be measured against the backdrop of this unprecedented order. And the ripple effects are only beginning. Allies, adversaries, and casual observers alike are all recalculating their positions, reassessing loyalties, and waiting to see what the next move will be. For Harry, the clock is ticking, and every passing moment carries a weight that is almost unbearable. So, where does Harry go from here? What are the consequences of this sudden shift in his life, both personally and publicly? How will King Charles handle the fallout of his decision? And what does this mean for the family dynamic moving forward? The answers are not yet clear, and perhaps they will only emerge in the coming days, months, and years. One thing is certain, nothing will be the same. 5 minutes ago, Harry was prince. 5 minutes later, he is no longer. And the world is holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The morning was deceptively calm. The kind of calm that makes you forget the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. In Harry's case, it was the kind of calm that always felt temporary, a fragile illusion hanging over a life that had never known true normalcy. He sipped his coffee, glanced at the news headlines, and tried to convince himself that the world was ordinary. Yet, even in this quiet moment, a tension lingered, a nagging sense that something was about to change, something irreversible. Harry's life had always been lived under a microscope. From the moment he was born, the world seemed to exist both for and against him. Cameras followed him, tabloids speculated, and the royal family's every move was scrutinized to the smallest detail. Childhood memories were punctuated not by carefree play, but by flashes of camera bulbs and whispered commentary. And as he grew older, the pressure only intensified. Every decision carried weight. Every friendship was complicated by protocol. Every gesture dissected for hidden meaning. Yet, despite the relentless scrutiny, Harry had always found ways to assert himself, to carve a space where he could breathe, even if only briefly. This calm morning, however, felt different. There was an energy in the air that even he couldn't ignore, a sense that the tides of his life were shifting. Perhaps it was the flurry of messages from aides that arrived unusually early, or the subtle tension in Meghan's tone when she asked, "Have you heard from the palace yet?" The question was casual, almost mundane, but beneath it lay a weight of urgency. Harry's gut twisted. Something was coming, something he hadn't anticipated. For weeks, he had been building a new rhythm, trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. He had started engaging more in charitable work, participating in interviews that allowed him to speak his truth, and reconnecting with family members where possible. There was a tentative optimism, a fragile belief that bridges could be rebuilt. But optimism, as Harry had learned time and again, was a dangerous luxury in the world of royalty. And this morning, that illusion was about to shatter. The first sign that something was wrong came through a single text message from a senior palace aide. The message was curt, almost cryptic. Urgent. You need to respond immediately. No explanation. No context. Just urgency. Harry's pulse quickened. He read it again, trying to make sense of it. Something about the tone felt wrong, ominous in a way that went beyond routine palace communication. He glanced at Meghan, who had noticed his sudden shift in demeanor. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with concern. Harry shook his head, unsure how to explain the rising dread he felt. He tried to focus on the mundane tasks of the morning, coffee, checking emails, making plans for the day, but the message gnawed at him. Every instinct screamed that this was different, that this was not another minor royal inconvenience. Something significant was happening, and it involved him directly. He felt a familiar mix of anxiety and anticipation, the same mix that had accompanied every major turning point in his life. Only this time, the stakes felt unprecedented. By mid-morning, the calm had dissipated entirely. Another message arrived, more insistent. "The king needs to speak with you immediately. Please call now." Harry hesitated. A direct call from King Charles was rare, usually reserved for matters of utmost importance. The formality of the request, the insistence, sent a jolt of fear through him. He knew, deep down, that whatever awaited him would not be routine. There would be no small talk, no casual discussion. This was a message that carried the weight of authority, a prelude to a moment that could redefine everything. He stepped away from the house, phone in hand, and dialed the number. The line connected, and a familiar, measured voice greeted him. "Harry, it's time we spoke." The calm of the morning vanished in an instant. Harry's mind raced. Was this about family matters, about media appearances, about ongoing projects, or something more serious, something personal? He couldn't tell. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, but the words themselves carried a weight that left Harry momentarily breathless. As the conversation unfolded, Harry realized the enormity of what was being conveyed. The language was precise, deliberate, almost clinical, but its implications were seismic. He listened, trying to process each word, each inflection, each subtle pause. There was no room for negotiation, no hint of leniency, no escape from the reality being presented. The calm morning had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion. The storm had arrived, and he was at its center. Throughout the conversation, Harry's mind oscillated between disbelief and rising panic. How could this be happening? He had navigated so many challenges before, so many moments of public scrutiny and private tension, and yet nothing had prepared him for this. He thought of the life he had built with Meghan, the plans for their children, the carefully managed public persona he had cultivated. All of it now seemed fragile, precarious, teetering on the edge of an abyss. By the time the call ended, Harry felt unmoored. He walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street below, trying to anchor himself in some semblance of reality. But the world outside seemed distant, almost unreal. The order had been delivered, the die had been cast, and yet the implications were still unfolding. He knew, instinctively, that this was only the beginning. Every decision he would make in the coming days, every conversation, every public appearance, would be colored by this moment. And the world was watching, whether he liked it or not. Even as he tried to compose himself, messages began arriving from friends, advisors, and supporters, some expressing concern, others curiosity, all probing for information he couldn't yet provide. The palace, meanwhile, was moving with quiet urgency behind the scenes. Meetings were being convened, statements drafted, contingencies planned. Harry was caught in the eye of a storm he could see forming but could not yet fully comprehend. The calm had vanished, replaced by a tense anticipation that felt almost unbearable. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a strange clarity. Harry understood that this moment would define the next chapter of his life. Titles, privileges, public recognition, they were all part of a complex system that could shift in an instant. Losing the title of prince was not just a symbolic change. It was a seismic shift in identity, status, and influence. How he responded now would set the tone for everything that followed. There was no turning back. As the day wore on, Harry could feel the world closing in. Each phone call, each message, each glance from Meghan or an aide carried an unspoken question. What would he do next? How would he navigate this unprecedented moment? The palace itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if every corridor, every office, every member of the royal staff was holding its breath, waiting to see how the next scene would unfold. By evening, the reality of the morning's events had begun to sink in. Harry sat in silence, reflecting on how quickly life could change. 5 minutes ago, he had been a prince, a public figure defined by tradition and expectation. 5 minutes later, he was no longer. The weight of that loss, the implications for his family and public image, pressed down on him like a physical force. And yet, there was a spark of determination, a flicker of resilience. This was a moment that would test him in ways he had never imagined. He knew the coming days would be filled with difficult choices, public scrutiny, and private reflection. Every interaction, every statement, every decision would carry weight. Allies would watch closely, critics would pounce, and the world would interpret every move as a sign of weakness or strength. Harry was at the center of a storm whose full force he could only begin to understand. And as night fell, the calm that had defined the morning was nothing more than a memory. The palace was alive with activity, advisors strategizing, and Harry steeling himself for what was to come. He knew, with a certainty that was both frightening and exhilarating, that the next steps he took would define not just his future, but the course of his relationship with the monarchy, the public, and his own sense of identity. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Harry's phone rang. The kind of call you don't ignore. Even before he looked at the screen, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. The night was quiet, the house still, and for a moment, the world felt suspended in eerie silence. And then the ring shattered the calm. He picked up, heart pounding, and heard the voice that would change everything. "Harry, it's time we spoke." The words were calm, measured, but the weight behind them was undeniable. There was no warmth, no preamble, no ordinary family chatter. Just authority and expectation. Harry froze. He had fielded calls from the palace before, but this was different. This was not about charity work, public appearances, or minor family protocol. This call was about something profoundly personal and profoundly consequential. He tried to respond, to sound composed, but his voice betrayed him. "Yes, of course," he managed, swallowing hard. The line was silent for a moment, and then the voice continued, deliberate, steady. "The decision has been made, and it is immediate. You will need to adjust accordingly." Adjust? The word felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Harry had faced countless challenges in his life: media scrutiny, family tension, even personal loss, but nothing had prepared him for this. The tone, the urgency, the finality, it all pointed to something he could barely comprehend. Something that would redefine his identity, his status, and his future. What do you mean? Harry asked, voice trembling. He tried to keep his tone even, but the panic was unmistakable. You are no longer prince, came the reply, calm but absolute. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Harry felt the room spin, the walls closing in. No title, no recognition, no traditional status. 5 minutes ago, he had carried the weight and privilege of the monarchy. 5 minutes later, it had been stripped away. And it had come not in a formal announcement, not in a letter with signatures and ceremony, but over a simple phone call in the middle of the night. Harry sank into a chair, gripping the edge of the table, trying to ground himself. The room was suddenly too small, too quiet, too heavy. What did this mean for him? For Meghan? For Archie and Lilibet? How would the world react? The questions tumbled through his mind, each one more urgent than the last. You understand the implications? The voice continued. This is final. There will be no negotiation. He swallowed hard. The implications were enormous. Titles were more than ceremonial. They were history, legacy, identity. They connected him to generations before him, to a lineage that carried both expectation and responsibility. Losing that title wasn't merely a matter of semantics. It was a rupture in the narrative of his life, a public severing of identity. And the timing, the immediacy, it left no room to prepare, no space to strategize. It was raw, unmediated, and absolute. Harry tried to compose himself. And this is the king's decision? He asked, almost hoping for a qualification, a loophole, anything that would allow him to cling to some vestige of his role. Yes, the reply was firm. Effective immediately. There is no alternative. The words reverberated in his mind. He had known there were tensions, disagreements, misunderstandings. He had braced himself for criticism, for public scrutiny, for even exclusion from certain royal duties. But he had not anticipated this. This sudden, irrevocable removal of his identity as a prince. It was a shock not only to him, but to everyone around him. When he hung up, the silence returned. But it was heavier now, laden with consequences and uncertainty. He sat in the darkness, staring at his phone, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. How could everything change in a single phone call? The fragility of his position, the reality of his public persona, all seemed to crystallize in that moment. And yet, despite the devastation, a small spark of clarity emerged. This was a turning point. There was no going back. Every decision he made from here on out would define not just his relationship with the monarchy, but the trajectory of his entire life. Meghan stirred beside him. She had sensed the tension, had woken with instinctive unease. "Harry, what is it?" she whispered, voice thick with concern. He hesitated, unsure how to explain. The words were simple, but carried unimaginable weight. I'm no longer prince," he said, barely above a whisper. The room was still again, but the silence was now shared, a quiet acknowledgement of the enormity of what had just happened. Meghan reached for his hand, a grounding presence in a moment of chaos. But even with support, the weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. How does one reconcile public identity with private shock? How does one navigate a world that had just redefined your place within it? By sunrise, the news, or at least the fact that something had shifted, was beginning to spread. Advisors had begun moving behind the scenes, drafting statements, planning contingencies, and consulting legal counsel. Harry and Meghan found themselves in a whirlwind of urgent communications, meetings, and strategy discussions. Every move required careful consideration. Every statement had to be measured, precise, and deliberate. But even as the logistical chaos unfolded, the emotional impact was immediate, raw, and inescapable. Harry retreated for a moment, alone, to process. He stared out at the early morning sky, trying to find grounding in the familiar patterns of life. Birds chirped, the wind moved gently through the trees, but the world outside felt distant, almost unreal. The phone call had changed everything. It wasn't just a title removed. It was a statement of authority, a message from the monarchy that the boundaries had shifted, and that his place in that system was no longer guaranteed. The day continued, but the sense of unease never left. Every interaction, every glance, every message carried an undercurrent of tension. Even casual conversations were colored by the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. The palace moved with silent urgency, and Harry and Meghan navigated the new reality with cautious determination. The world was beginning to notice that something significant had occurred, though few understood the full implications. Amid this unfolding storm, Harry found himself reflecting on what had brought him here. Every decision he had made, from stepping back from royal duties to speaking out publicly, from relocating his family to navigating media narratives, had contributed to this moment. And yet, despite understanding the chain of events, the immediacy and finality of the king's decision left him reeling. This wasn't a gradual consequence. It was a sharp, sudden rupture in his life. Even now, hours later, questions continued to swirl. Why now? Why in this manner? Was there a deeper strategy at play, or was this purely personal? And most pressing of all, what did this mean for the future, for relationships, for identity? Every answer seemed to lead to more questions, and every question underscored the reality that nothing about Harry's life would ever be the same again. As night fell, the palace remained active, advisors moving quietly, discussions continuing behind closed doors. Harry and Meghan tried to rest, but sleep was elusive. Every thought seemed to circle back to the phone call, to the irrevocable decision, to the sudden removal of a title that had defined him since birth. And through it all, one truth became clear. The next move, whatever it would be, had to be decisive. But just as Harry thought he had begun to understand the full scope of the situation, a new development emerged, a message, an unexpected visitor, a leak to the press, that would throw everything into chaos once again. Something was coming, something bigger than the initial shock, something that would force Harry to act, to respond, and to redefine himself entirely. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The morning light brought no comfort. Harry felt the weight of the previous night pressing down on him, each hour stretching longer than the last as the implications of the king's decision sank deeper. The call from Charles had been brief, formal, and devastating, but now the reality was beginning to take shape. It was one thing to hear that he was no longer prince in a whispered, authoritative tone over the phone. It was quite another to face the official decree, delivered through channels that left no room for interpretation or escape. By mid-morning, Buckingham Palace had circulated the formal announcement to relevant officials. The language was precise, almost surgical, stripping away ambiguity. It read like a legal order, but carried far greater emotional weight. Effective immediately, Prince Henry Charles Albert David shall no longer carry the title of Prince of the United Kingdom, nor hold any associated privileges or responsibilities inherent to the role. This action is sanctioned by His Majesty, King Charles III, in accordance with established constitutional protocols and the prerogatives of the monarchy. Harry stared at the words, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. He had always known that monarchy was a system built on rules, precedent, and hierarchy, but he had never imagined that he would find himself subject to such an abrupt and absolute removal. Titles were more than just symbols. They were markers of identity, of heritage, of belonging. And suddenly, every marker he had carried since birth had been stripped away. The decree did not come with explanation beyond the technical legalities. There was no rationale, no personal note, no attempt to soften the blow. It was final, public, and absolute. And in the immediate aftermath, Harry realized just how many facets of his life were now destabilized. His roles in charitable foundations, ceremonial duties, public recognition, and even protocol for family events, all were now in flux. The legal ramifications were immediate, but the personal ones were far more devastating. He thought about Meghan and the children, wondering how this would be perceived publicly and privately. Archie and Lilibet were too young to fully understand the implications, yet Harry worried about the invisible weight this change would place on them. Every interaction, every school activity, every public appearance would now carry additional scrutiny. Even the most mundane tasks would be colored by the shadow of the decree. By noon, the palace communications team had begun carefully crafting talking points. They were briefed on the line to use if approached by media, the subtleties of wording for public statements, and strategies to control narrative damage. But despite their meticulous planning, the sense of chaos was palpable. Leaks were inevitable. Speculation was inevitable. Every journalist with a camera, every social media user with a platform, would seize on this moment. And the framing could not be entirely controlled. Harry retreated to a private room, surrounded by trusted aides and Meghan. The weight of the decree pressed down in a way that was both professional and deeply personal. Titles were, after all, symbols of identity as much as protocol. Losing the designation prince was not merely a professional demotion. It was a public declaration that his role within the royal family, as it had been defined since birth, was no longer recognized. The psychological impact was profound. He thought back to moments of his youth, when he had played in palaces and gardens, surrounded by ceremony, expectation, and history. The transition from carefree childhood to public life had always been abrupt, but the identity had remained. Now, that continuity was broken. He felt untethered, caught in a liminal space between who he had been and who he was expected to be. The king's decision, while official, also carried symbolic weight. It was a clear message not just to Harry but to the world. Roles in the monarchy are contingent, titles are privileges, and authority rests firmly with the sovereign. There was no room for negotiation, no compromise, no sentimentality. It was a stark reminder that tradition and hierarchy could supersede familial bonds, and that decisions, once made at the highest level, were irreversible. Harry considered the media storm that would inevitably follow. Social media platforms were already buzzing with speculation, rumors, and debates. Headlines would range from sympathetic to scandalous. Analysts would dissect the constitutional implications. Commentators would speculate about personal motives. Each day of silence would be filled with scrutiny. Each movement of Harry and Meghan's would be parsed for hidden meaning. And all the while, the public narrative would begin to crystallize, defining him not on his own terms, but through the lens of this decree. By late afternoon, aides had compiled the first wave of responses from various family members and royal officials. There were expressions of concern, cautious words of support, and subtle notes of detachment. The palace was a theater of carefully measured reactions, each response designed to maintain decorum while signaling alignment or neutrality. With the king's decision, Harry realized that this was not merely about him. It was about perception, authority, and control. The decree was as much a strategic move as it was a personal one. As he absorbed the weight of these realities, Harry felt a mixture of anger, grief, and determination. The anger was immediate and visceral. How could a single decision undo decades of identity and effort? The grief was profound, the loss of connection, recognition, and familial affirmation. But the determination was perhaps the most significant. The drive to respond, to assert agency, to find a path forward despite the abrupt and jarring change. He began to consider his options, thinking through every possible response. Public statements, private communications, legal consultations, strategic media engagement. All were possibilities, yet each carried risk. Every move could escalate the situation, attract scrutiny, or inadvertently concede ground. He was acutely aware that in this environment, caution was essential, but so was action. Hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. Missteps could be amplified beyond repair. Even in this intense moment, Harry was struck by the irony of the situation. For years, he had sought to step back from the monarchy, to live a life less constrained by tradition and public expectation. Yet, the sudden removal of his title thrust him even further into the spotlight, forcing him to confront public scrutiny in ways he had tried to avoid. The very act intended to redefine and control his role had, paradoxically, made him more visible, more scrutinized, and more central to the unfolding narrative than ever before. As evening approached, Harry and Meghan convened with their closest advisors to discuss strategy. The discussions were intense, balancing emotional reactions with pragmatic considerations. Every word, every tone, every potential public statement was dissected and analyzed. Harry felt the weight of responsibility, not just for himself, but for his family, for his legacy, and for the countless eyes watching his every move. The king's decree was not merely a personal blow. It was a catalyst for a series of decisions that would unfold publicly, dramatically, and with far-reaching consequences. And yet, even in this moment of tension, there was an undercurrent of resilience. Harry had faced crises before: media scrutiny, public criticism, personal loss, and he had survived. He had adapted, learned, and evolved. While the royal decree represented a seismic shift, it also presented an opportunity to redefine himself, to assert agency in a system designed to constrain, and to navigate a world that would be watching every decision he made. But just as he began to formulate a plan, a new complication emerged: a leak, an unofficial report, a hint of information that had not been authorized by the palace. It suggested that the king's decision was not only immediate but part of a broader strategy that no one outside the inner circle fully understood. This revelation sent a jolt of urgency through Harry and his team. Every action, every statement, every response had to be carefully considered. The situation was evolving, unpredictable, and fraught with consequences beyond anything he had previously imagined. Harry stared out the window as night fell, contemplating the scope of what had just occurred. Titles, privileges, legacy, they were all stripped away in a single, decisive stroke. The formal decree had landed, but the ramifications were just beginning to ripple outward. Allies, critics, media, and the public were all poised to react, and Harry's response would shape the narrative for weeks, months, and perhaps years. And then it hit him: the reality that the world would see him differently now, that history would record him differently, that even within his own family, relationships might never be the same. The decree was more than an administrative order. It was a public statement, a declaration, a pivot point that would influence every facet of his life. But just as Harry began to brace himself for the inevitable fallout, an unexpected message arrived. One that hinted at an even deeper layer of intrigue. One that suggested that the king's decree was only the beginning of a series of events that no one could yet predict. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the decree became known, the world erupted. Within seconds of Buckingham Palace issuing the formal statement, news outlets across the globe scrambled to cover the story. Breaking news banners flashed on television screens, social media exploded with speculation, and journalists flooded digital platforms with commentary, analysis, and sometimes outright conjecture. For Harry, the chaos was instantaneous, overwhelming, and inescapable. Even before the first official headlines hit, rumors had begun circulating. Social media users pieced together fragmented information, offering theories ranging from political strategy to personal vendetta. Memes appeared almost immediately, some sympathetic, some mocking, and some downright cruel. A private, contained family matter had exploded into a global spectacle. For Harry and Meghan, the sudden intrusion of public scrutiny was both expected and terrifying. By midday, the sheer volume of coverage was staggering. News channels ran rolling broadcasts analyzing the king's decision. Political commentators speculated on constitutional implications. Royal historians dissected precedents, noting the rarity and unprecedented swiftness of removing a prince's title in the modern era. Even entertainment media treated the story like a drama series, framing the events as a real-life palace thriller. Every angle, every headline, every tweet amplified the tension. Harry and Meghan watched the unfolding frenzy from a secure, private room. Meghan scrolled through her phone, disbelief etched across her face. "It's everywhere," she said softly. "Every headline, every story, every reaction, it's all about you." Harry nodded but couldn't bring himself to respond. The magnitude of it all was crushing. 5 minutes ago, he had been dealing with a personal shock. Now, the world was observing, judging, and interpreting every detail of his response. Each news outlet offered a slightly different narrative, some sympathetic, some critical, some outright sensationalized. The variance only heightened the sense of uncertainty. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, he had tried to distance himself from the media circus surrounding the royal family. He had sought privacy, normalcy, and control over his own narrative. And yet, this very event, an attempt by the monarchy to assert authority, clarify hierarchy, or possibly protect tradition, had thrown him squarely back into the media spotlight, more visible and scrutinized than ever before. Throughout the afternoon, the press frenzy intensified. Television anchors debated the motivations behind the king's decision, weighing historical precedent against personal dynamics. Newspapers ran feature articles with headlines that ranged from sympathetic, Prince Harry's sudden fall from grace, to sensationalist, royal betrayal, Harry stripped of his title. Social media exploded in real-time reactions, hashtags trending globally, and fan accounts weighing in with emotion, analysis, and speculation. Every comment, every share, every post added to the pressure. Friends, colleagues, and supporters reached out to Harry with their reactions. Some offered reassurance. Others expressed concern over how the public might perceive him. Legal and media advisors warned that public statements needed to be carefully calibrated. Any slip could be seized upon, misinterpreted, or distorted. Every detail mattered now, from the tone of a statement to the timing of a tweet. Harry felt a rising wave of anxiety. The media frenzy wasn't just reporting the event, it was shaping the narrative, influencing public perception, and potentially affecting every relationship he had within the royal family. Allies might distance themselves, critics would seize on any misstep, and the public's perception would harden long before he had a chance to clarify. The decree was no longer just a legal or family matter. It had become a global spectacle, a story of intrigue, conflict, and emotion, played out in real time across every platform imaginable. As the hours passed, the intensity of the coverage created its own pressure. Journalists tried to obtain statements, paparazzi circled locations, and online commentary often blurred the line between fact and speculation. Harry realized that controlling the narrative was now nearly impossible. Every move he made, public or private, would be scrutinized, interpreted, and discussed endlessly. The media had seized the story, and it would not relinquish it. Even mundane actions carried symbolic weight. Walking through a room, greeting friends, or attending a meeting could be photographed, analyzed, and reported on. Every expression, every glance, every choice of words could be construed as defiance, submission, anger, or reconciliation. The boundaries between personal experience and public perception had blurred completely. The emotional toll was immediate. Harry felt trapped in a surreal feedback loop. Shock from the decree, compounded by the realization that the world was watching, judging, and reacting before he had even fully processed what had occurred. The emotional spikes, fear, anger, grief, and determination, flickered rapidly, leaving him both exhausted and hyper-aware. He understood that the media frenzy was more than background noise. It was an active participant, shaping events even as they unfolded. Amid the chaos, Meghan remained a stabilizing presence. She reminded him to breathe, to pause, and to focus on the steps that were within his control. But even she could not shield him from the relentless scrutiny. The couple realized that this media storm was unlike anything they had encountered before. The speed, scale, and intensity were unprecedented, and the ramifications would extend far beyond a single headline or news cycle. By evening, the narrative had begun to solidify in the public consciousness. Many outlets framed the story as a personal conflict between father and son, while others emphasized constitutional or historical implications. Social media commentary oscillated between outrage, sympathy, and speculation about potential next moves. Harry and Meghan were acutely aware that the world's perception of him was now being rewritten in real time, influenced as much by interpretation as by fact. And yet, despite the chaos, Harry understood that the story was far from over. This media frenzy, as intense as it was, represented only the beginning of the unfolding consequences. Every statement, every appearance, every action he took in the coming days would be measured against this first wave of coverage. Allies would watch, critics would scrutinize, and history would record not just the decree itself, but the public and personal reactions it provoked. As night fell, the media machine continued its relentless momentum. News channels aired panels discussing possible motives, Twitter feeds swarmed with commentary, and newspapers published analysis articles with titles like The Fall of a Prince and Royal Titles in Turmoil. Harry and Meghan remained in a private space, aware that each passing moment carried the potential to either mitigate or exacerbate the situation. The world was watching, and every decision now mattered. Then, just as it seemed the media frenzy had reached a plateau, an unanticipated development occurred. A confidential document, previously considered secure, leaked to the press. It contained details of internal palace deliberations, hinting at motives, strategies, and personal dynamics that were never meant for public consumption. The leak sparked a new wave of headlines, social media speculation, and public debate, threatening to magnify the impact of the original decree even further. Harry stared at the phone in disbelief. Every day brought new surprises, new pressures, new challenges. The media frenzy, which had seemed overwhelming at first, now felt like a living entity, responding to events, influencing perception, and shaping the narrative in unpredictable ways. And yet, amidst the chaos, one fact remained clear. The king's order had not only redefined Harry's identity, it had ignited a global spectacle that would continue to unfold with increasing intensity. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The storm of headlines, social media frenzy, and public speculation did not subside as Harry and Meghan attempted to regain their footing. If anything, it intensified. And amidst the chaos, Harry began to notice something unsettling. The subtle shifts in loyalty, the thinly veiled stances of those he once considered allies, and the silent scrutiny of those who had always wielded influence behind palace walls. In the world of royalty, allies are as rare as trust itself, and in times of crisis, the line between friend and foe becomes razor-thin. Harry had long understood that family dynamics were complicated, especially in an institution as hierarchical and public as the monarchy. Relationships are carefully calibrated, often driven by protocol, legacy, and image. But the removal of his title introduced a new variable, one that unsettled even the most stable connections. Allies became cautious, advisors became measured, and even friends hesitated to speak too freely. The message was clear: in moments of crisis, perception is power, and every alignment, or misalignment, can shift the balance of influence. The first ripple of uncertainty came from within the family itself. William, Harry's older brother, had always maintained a sense of duty to the monarchy that bordered on rigid. Their relationship, already strained by decades of comparisons, public scrutiny, and private disagreements, now faced its ultimate test. William's initial response was measured, diplomatic, but tinged with caution. Publicly, he offered support in general terms, emphasizing family bonds and unity. Privately, however, aides reported that he was considering the broader implications of Harry's removal from the line of formal duties. Every interaction with Harry would now carry subtle tension. Every word weighed for its loyalty and impact. Other family members reacted differently. Some expressed sympathy quietly, through private messages and behind-the-scenes support, yet feared public association could harm their own standing. Others remained distant, neutral, or outwardly disengaged, unwilling to risk entanglement in what was becoming an intensely scrutinized family drama. Harry quickly realized that the palace hierarchy, always subtle and layered, had shifted overnight. Allies who had seemed steadfast could no longer be counted on, and those who appeared distant might be key observers, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Outside the family, advisors and confidants revealed themselves in surprising ways. Some, long trusted for guidance, began hedging their advice, balancing Harry's interests with the realities of a monarchy in flux. Legal advisors spoke in measured tones, emphasizing caution over impulsivity. Media strategists cautioned about public perception, highlighting the potential risks of any response that could be misinterpreted. Even Meghan, steadfast and perceptive, noted subtle shifts in loyalty among their inner circle. Advisors who had once been proactive now increasingly deferred to the unfolding palace strategy. Harry began to notice patterns in the reactions. Allies who had been vocal and assertive before were now hesitant, offering only conditional support. Some friends outside the palace sphere offered emotional encouragement, but were limited in their ability to intervene publicly. The more he observed, the more he realized that in the aftermath of the king's decree, true allies were scarce. Trust, already fragile in the royal environment, had been tested to its limits. And then there were the adversaries, subtle but unmistakable. Individuals who had quietly resented Harry's public initiatives, his independence, or his deviation from royal expectations now saw opportunity. The king's decree provided a pretext for criticism, for distancing, and in some cases, for maneuvering against him. These adversaries did not act openly. Their tactics were subtle, their influence diffuse, but the impact was tangible. Every misstep, every hesitation, every emotional response could be magnified, reframed, and weaponized. At the same time, unexpected support emerged from surprising quarters. Friends and allies outside the traditional royal framework, philanthropic partners, international contacts, and a few sympathetic members of the royal staff offered guidance, emotional reinforcement, and even discreet strategic advice. These allies provided not only perspective, but also a reminder that influence and support could extend beyond palace walls. Yet, even with this encouragement, the environment remained volatile, unpredictable, and intensely scrutinized. Harry's understanding of alliances, trust, and power deepened in those early days. He realized that navigating relationships in this new reality required a combination of intuition, caution, and decisiveness. Every conversation, every decision, every engagement had to be carefully considered. Allies needed reassurance. Potential adversaries required careful management. And the public narrative demanded proactive engagement to prevent misrepresentation. Within this complex landscape, Harry began mapping the dynamics, weighing motives, and identifying potential risks. The removal of his title had not only affected him personally, it had disrupted the delicate balance of relationships across the royal family and their extended network of influence. Every ally's position was now conditional, every adversary's opportunity amplified, and every interaction carried the potential to shape perception, reputation, and ultimately, his future. Emotional tensions compounded the strategic considerations. Harry found himself oscillating between vulnerability and resolve. The betrayal felt deeply personal, yet he understood that responding emotionally could exacerbate the situation. Maintaining composure became essential, but even composure carried its own pressures. In the palace, every display of emotion or restraint was observed, analyzed, and interpreted. Allies gauged his reactions for signs of weakness or opportunity. Adversaries watched for indications of strategy or hesitation. By the end of the first week following the decree, Harry had begun to develop a sense of the battlefield before him. The environment was a mix of subtle alliances, hidden agendas, cautious support, and strategic maneuvering. The king's decision had not only stripped him of a title, it had redefined the political, social, and emotional terrain he now had to navigate. Every step required careful calculation, every interaction was a test, and every statement carried the potential to influence perception far beyond his immediate circle. Even Meghan, whose strength and insight had been invaluable, observed that the dynamics were shifting daily. Allies became hesitant. Old friends reassessed priorities. The palace itself operated with quiet intensity, each move calculated, each word measured. Harry realized that the challenge was not only surviving this immediate crisis, but understanding and managing the complex web of relationships that had now been altered. The path forward was fraught with uncertainty, and the stakes could not be higher. And then, just as he began to feel a semblance of understanding, a surprising development emerged. A trusted insider, long considered neutral, provided information suggesting that the king's decision was not just about protocol or tradition, it might be part of a larger strategic move within the monarchy. The revelation raised more questions than it answered, and hinted at consequences even deeper than Harry had anticipated. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The formal decree removing Harry's title was not just a personal blow, it was a legal earthquake. Titles, privileges, and royal duties are not only ceremonial. They are enshrined in centuries of law, precedent, and constitutional interpretation. And now, Harry found himself thrust into a complex legal labyrinth he had never anticipated navigating. The moment he read the decree, he knew that the implications were profound, intricate, and potentially far-reaching. The first step was understanding the decree itself. While it was presented in clear, authoritative language, its legal ramifications were anything but simple. The removal of a princely title in the modern monarchy is rare, virtually unprecedented in recent times. Historical cases existed, of course, but most occurred centuries ago, in entirely different social, political, and legal contexts. Harry's situation was unique. He was a senior royal, publicly known around the world, and the decision had immediate and international ramifications. Every legal avenue, every potential challenge, had to be carefully evaluated. His team of legal advisors assembled quickly. Barristers with experience in constitutional law, royal protocol, and international legal considerations began poring over every detail of the decree. Each word was dissected. What powers did the king legitimately hold? Were there precedents to challenge the timing or the method of implementation? Did Harry retain any residual rights to certain titles, honors, or privileges? Every clause, every sentence, became a point of strategy and negotiation. Even with this legal expertise, the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. The monarchy operates within a mix of tradition, law, and unwritten precedent. Unlike a normal legal system, the rules are often opaque, interpreted differently depending on context, and enforced selectively. A misstep in approach could risk not only public perception, but also the fragile alliances Harry had left. A misjudgment could alienate key advisors, provoke a media backlash, or unintentionally concede authority to his detractors. As he navigated this new terrain, Harry realized just how much he had taken for granted. For decades, his role had been defined by a combination of birthright, tradition, and expectation. The legal structures had always existed in the background, invisible and unchallenged. Now, stripped of his title, every legal nuance became essential. Every historical precedent mattered, every interpretation was critical, and every decision carried the weight of both history and public scrutiny. Beyond the palace walls, the legal labyrinth extended into public perception. Media outlets were dissecting the decree with lawyerly precision, highlighting potential inconsistencies, ambiguities, and historical context. Social media users debated constitutional authority and royal prerogatives as if they were court experts. Every article, every thread, and every opinion added layers of complexity to Harry's task. He had to not only understand the legal realities, but also anticipate how they would be interpreted and misinterpreted by millions. Among the advisors, strategies varied. Some suggested a quiet acceptance, emphasizing diplomacy and public image. Others advocated a more assertive approach, exploring legal challenges and procedural nuances to reclaim rights, clarify misunderstandings, or at least secure acknowledgement of certain privileges. Harry understood that each strategy carried risk. A quiet acceptance could appear weak. A legal confrontation could be framed as defiance, inflaming public perception or family tension. Every path was fraught with potential fallout. Amid the discussions, Harry began to grasp another dimension: the international implications. As a senior royal, his title and duties had significance not only in the UK, but across the Commonwealth. Legal decisions in London reverberated in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and beyond. The removal of his title wasn't just a domestic matter. It was a signal to governments, institutions, and the global public. Diplomatic and protocol considerations entered every legal conversation, adding layers of complexity that extended far beyond personal grievance. Then there was the personal element, how this legal labyrinth affected his family. Meghan, ever perceptive, observed the tension between technical legality and emotional reality. For Archie and Lilibet, the changes were subtle but profound. Titles, recognition, and public perception mattered in ways that children often absorb unconsciously. The legal intricacies weren't abstract. They had real-life consequences for Harry's ability to navigate identity, privilege, and family legacy. As the hours turned into days, Harry became increasingly immersed in the legal maze. He studied historical precedents, consulted constitutional experts, and explored every possible avenue of recourse. The complexity was staggering. Every potential move had consequences, every option had risks, and every decision required a delicate balance of assertiveness and diplomacy. The legal labyrinth was not just about winning or losing. It was about preserving integrity, reputation, and the future of his family. And just when Harry thought he had begun to understand the scope of the labyrinth, an unexpected complication emerged. A confidential legal opinion, leaked to the media, suggested that the king's authority might extend further than anyone outside the inner circle had realized. Headlines erupted, legal analysts debated, and social media erupted with speculation. The leak didn't just complicate strategy. It amplified uncertainty, raised questions about power, and suggested that the legal stakes were higher than even Harry had imagined. He realized that in this environment, strategy was not just about legal acumen. It was about timing, perception, and influence. Each statement, each legal maneuver, each public appearance could shift the narrative in unpredictable ways. Allies and adversaries alike would watch closely, waiting for signs of weakness or opportunity. And Harry, stripped of his title, yet still in the public eye, had to navigate a system designed for hierarchy, tradition, and control, all while maintaining his personal integrity and the well-being of his family. By nightfall, the enormity of the situation weighed heavily. Harry sat with Meghan and his advisors, mapping out contingencies, weighing the risks, and preparing for the next phase. The legal labyrinth was vast, convoluted, and constantly shifting, but he understood one thing clearly. Inaction was not an option. Every moment of hesitation could be interpreted as submission, and every public move would be scrutinized. The stakes were higher than ever, and the path forward was as perilous as it was uncertain. And just when he thought the situation couldn't become more complex, a new development emerged. An unexpected legal twist that threatened to escalate the crisis even further, involving not just titles, but inheritance, precedents, and privileges tied to centuries of royal tradition. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The world had heard the news, and now it was reacting. Headlines blared across continents, social media erupted with debate, and political commentators suddenly weighed in on a matter that had, until now, been considered a private royal affair. For Harry, the ripple effect of the king's decree was no longer confined to family tensions, media scrutiny, or legal complexity. It had become a public spectacle with political overtones. By mid-morning, newspapers and digital outlets ran front-page analyses. The titles ranged from sympathetic, "The Prince Who Lost His Crown," to scathing, "Royal Rebellion Punished." In the UK, politicians felt compelled to comment. Some framed it as an internal family matter, emphasizing the monarchy's autonomy and traditions.